To understand the escape, you must first understand the prison, and to understand the prison, you must understand why it existed at all. By the early 1930s, America had a problem. The federal prison system was being overwhelmed by a new breed of criminal: bank robbers, gangsters, men who'd grown rich and powerful during Prohibition, who'd built criminal empires, who'd corrupted entire police departments and city governments, men who escaped from county jails like they were changing hotels. The problem wasn't just that these criminals were dangerous. The problem was that they were good at being criminals. They had money for lawyers, for bribes, for elaborate escape plans. They had connections on the outside who could facilitate breaks. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain by trying. Regular prisons couldn't hold them. So the Bureau of Prisons, under the direction of Attorney General Homer Cummings, decided to build something new. Not just a prison, a super prison, a facility so secure, so isolated, so psychologically crushing that even the thought of escape would seem absurd. They chose Alcatraz Island. It had been a military prison since the 1860s, sitting in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by water too cold and currents too strong for any prisoner to survive. The location was perfect. Natural security that required no guards, no fences, no walls. Just water, just physics. The military installation was converted, upgraded, fortified. Gun towers were installed at strategic points. Metal detectors, the newest technology, were placed at key choke points. Every bar, every lock, every door was designed to be escape-proof. The cell blocks were renovated to eliminate blind spots. Guard stations were positioned to maintain constant visual surveillance, and the cells themselves were masterpieces of minimalist containment. 5 feet by 9 feet, a cot, a sink, a toilet, a small shelf, nothing else. No privacy, no comfort. Just enough space to exist, but not enough to live. The cells were arranged in blocks: B block, C block, D block for the worst offenders. Solitary confinement so brutal it broke men's minds. The cell blocks formed the core of the prison, a fortress within a fortress. Steel cages stacked 3 levels high, every inmate visible, monitored, controlled. Alcatraz opened as a federal penitentiary on August 11, 1934. The first prisoners arrived by boat, chained, surrounded by armed guards, staring at their new home with the cold realization that this was where they would likely die. The rules were simple and absolute. No newspapers or magazines except approved educational materials. No radio, no contact with the outside world except heavily censored letters and 1 visit per month through a glass partition. No talking during meals, no unauthorized movement, no deviation from routine. Work was mandatory. The prison operated a laundry service, a clothing factory, various maintenance operations. Prisoners worked 8 hours a day, every day for pennies. Not because the prison needed the labor, but because idle hands and idle minds were security risks. Work kept them tired. Work kept them docile. Recreation was 1 hour per day in the exercise yard, a concrete rectangle surrounded by high walls where prisoners could walk in circles, lift weights, play cards under the watchful eyes of guards in towers, armed with rifles. 1 hour of limited freedom, then back to the cells. The psychological design was as important as the physical design. The worst part of Alcatraz wasn't the isolation or the cold or the cells. The worst part was that you could see San Francisco. Every single day. The city was right there, visible through the fog, close enough to hear faint sounds of life. Car horns, foghorns. On New Year's Eve, if the wind was right, you could hear parties, celebrations, people living free lives while you rotted in a cage. That proximity was torture. It was deliberate. The message was clear. The world continues without you. Life goes on, and you will never be part of it again. For the first 28 years of Alcatraz's operation, that message held true. Men tried to escape. Most were caught before they left the cell block. Some made it to the water and drowned. 2 made it to shore and were shot. Nobody succeeded. The rock was unbroken. And then Franklin Morris arrived. Morris was transferred to Alcatraz on January 20th, 1960. He was 33 years old. He'd been in and out of prison since he was 13, starting with a conviction for narcotics possession. His criminal record was long but not particularly violent. Burglary, armed robbery. He wasn't a murderer or a psychopath. He was a thief, a smart thief. What set Morris apart was his mind. IQ tests conducted during his incarceration showed a score of 133, high enough to qualify as gifted, high enough to see patterns others missed, to plan multiple steps ahead, to solve complex problems under pressure. But more importantly, Morris had a track record. He'd escaped from prison before, not once, multiple times. He'd broken out of a Louisiana parish prison, escaped from a facility in Florida, was recaptured, sent to another prison, escaped again. He wasn't just smart, he was persistent, determined, unwilling to accept confinement as permanent. That's why he was sent to Alcatraz. Not because he was dangerous to people, but because he was dangerous to the system. He was the type of prisoner Alcatraz was designed for, the escape artist, the man who needed to be taught that escape was impossible. Morris was assigned to cell B-138, on the second tier of B block. The cell was identical to hundreds of others, 5 by 9, concrete walls, steel bars, a ventilation grate on the back wall, about 6 inches by 9 inches, covered with a metal grill. That grate would become the focus of Morris's attention, but not immediately. First he had to study, observe,
learn the rhythms of the prison.
Morris was patient, methodical. He watched the guards, noting their routines. He watched the other prisoners, assessing who could be trusted, who had useful skills, who was desperate enough to try something insane. He studied the prison's architecture. Alcatraz had been built in stages over decades. The cell blocks were modern, steel and concrete, but behind the cells, in the utility corridors and service passages, the structure was older. Brick and mortar from the original military prison, materials that had been exposed to salt air and moisture for 100 years. Morris understood what the guards didn't. The prison looked impenetrable, but it was rotting from the inside. The salt air corroded metal. Moisture weakened concrete. The very elements that made escape so dangerous also made the prison vulnerable. The ventilation grates were the weak point. They were designed to allow air circulation, to keep the cells from becoming suffocating boxes, but they opened into utility corridors, maintenance spaces that ran behind the cell blocks, spaces that weren't monitored because nobody thought a prisoner could get through the grates. Morris began testing his grate, pushing on it, feeling for movement, and he discovered something remarkable. The concrete around the grate had softened. Decades of moisture and salt had turned solid concrete into something closer to packed dirt. It could be chipped away, carved, removed. But he couldn't do it alone. The work would take months. He needed help. He needed partners who were as desperate as he was, as skilled, as willing to risk everything. He found them in John and Clarence Anglin. The Anglin brothers had arrived at Alcatraz in 1960, transferred from Leavenworth after an escape attempt. They were from Georgia, from a large family, bank robbers with a reputation for non-violent crimes. They were in their early 30s, strong, practical men with mechanical skills and farming backgrounds.
What made them valuable to Morris was their bond.
Brothers are different from other prisoners. They trust each other completely. They won't inform. They won't betray. And they have a shared motivation, stronger than any individual desire for freedom. They have each other. Morris approached them carefully. Prison walls have ears. Guards have informants. One word to the wrong person, and the plan would be over before it began. But Morris had been observing the Anglins for months. He knew they were solid, knew they could be trusted. The conversation probably happened during recreation time, in the yard, speaking quietly while appearing to play cards or lift weights. Morris would have laid out the basics, the grates, the utility corridors, the possibility of breaching the exterior defenses, and most importantly, the plan for crossing the bay. The Anglins understood immediately. This wasn't a spontaneous, desperate scramble. This was engineering. This was a project that would require time, tools, materials, and absolute secrecy. But it was possible. Difficult, yes. Dangerous, certainly. But possible. And possible was enough. A fourth man was brought in. Alan West, another bank robber, another repeat escape artist. West had the cell next to Morris, and he'd noticed the same weaknesses in the ventilation system. He was eager to join, eager to contribute. The team was assembled, 4 men with nothing to lose, and a plan that would require perfect execution over months of patient, terrifying work. 4 men who would attempt what everyone said couldn't be done. They began in late 1961, slowly, carefully, one chip of concrete at a time, using tools they fashioned from whatever they could steal or scavenge, spoons sharpened into chisels, a vacuum cleaner motor converted into a drill, bits of metal shaped into saws. The noise was a problem. Every scrape, every chip, every scratch of metal on concrete could alert the guards, so they worked during the noisiest times.
During the industrial sounds of the prison's machinery.
During music hour, when inmates were allowed to play instruments, John Anglin played accordion, and the wheeze of the instrument covered the sound of chipping concrete. The work was exhausting. The concrete was soft but still resistant. Hours of chipping would remove only inches, and it all had to be done in darkness, by feel, while maintaining the appearance of normal prison behavior. The removed concrete had to be disposed of. They couldn't just pile it in their cells, so they scattered it during recreation time, grinding it into powder and letting it blow away in the wind, mixing it with dirt, hiding it under equipment, making the evidence disappear, one handful at a time. And they had to maintain the deception. The holes they were carving had to remain hidden, so they made false fronts, pieces of cardboard painted to match the walls, held in place with a dab of cement. From even a few feet away, the grates looked intact. Only close inspection would reveal the truth. But close inspection was unlikely. The guards were confident. Alcatraz was escape-proof. Why would they look for escape attempts? Why would they suspect that prisoners were literally tunneling out of their cells? Months passed. The holes grew larger, large enough for a man to fit through, large enough to access the utility corridor behind the cells. And once they were in that corridor, they would have access to the entire prison infrastructure: plumbing, electrical, ventilation shafts, a network of passages that led up, to the roof, to the exterior, to freedom. But breaching the cells was only the first step. They still had to get past the guards, past the gun towers, off the island, and across the bay. Each step required its own preparation, its own carefully planned solution. And that's where Morris's genius truly showed. He wasn't just planning an escape. He was orchestrating a masterpiece of deception, engineering, and timing that would require everything to work perfectly. One mistake, one guard who happened to look too closely, one tool that broke at the wrong moment, and they would spend the rest of their lives in D-block solitary confinement, broken, forgotten, examples of what happened when you challenged the rock. The plan came together slowly, like a puzzle with 1,000 pieces, each one carefully placed, each one essential. And as 1961 became 1962, as spring turned to early summer, the escape moved from possibility to inevitability. They were going to do it. They were going to break out of Alcatraz. And if they died in the attempt, at least they would die trying. At least they would die as men who refused to accept the word impossible. The date was chosen, June 11th, 1962, a Monday night. The weather forecast showed fog, which was perfect. Low visibility would hide their movement. The tides would be right, or as right as they ever were. Everything aligned. All that remained was to execute, to put months of preparation into action, to step through the hole in the wall and into the unknown. Frank Morris lay on his bunk the night before, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the prison settling for the night, the footsteps of guards, the distant clang of metal doors, the ever-present sound of wind and water. Tomorrow, if everything went according to plan, he would be free, or he would be dead. Either way, he would no longer be a prisoner. The rock had held for 28 years. Tomorrow night, 3 men would try to break it, and history would remember them forever, whether as heroes or fools, as escapees or corpses. The stage was set. The plan was ready. All that remained was to see if impossible was really impossible, or just a word used by people who'd never tried hard enough. Tomorrow, the rock would be tested, and Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin would either prove the experts wrong
or join the long list of men who died trying.
The escape from Alcatraz was about to begin. The hardest part of any prison escape isn't getting out. It's not being discovered. It's buying time, because every minute the guards think you're still in your cell is a minute you have to get farther away, to put distance between yourself and the inevitable manhunt. Frank Morris understood this perfectly. The physical escape, chipping through concrete, navigating the utility corridors, breaching the exterior, that was engineering. Difficult, but solvable. But the deception, the misdirection, the art of making guards see what they expected to see rather than what was actually there, that required genius. The solution came from a surprising place, a beauty parlor. Not an actual beauty parlor, of course, this was Alcatraz. But the prison did have a barber shop, and that barber shop had something invaluable: hair. Clippings swept up after every haircut, gathered in bags usually thrown away. But Morris and the Anglins began collecting it, slowly, carefully, a little bit at a time so no one would notice. Human hair, the key to the entire deception. The plan was simple in concept, impossibly difficult in execution. They would create decoys, dummy heads that could be placed on pillows, under blankets, creating the illusion of a sleeping prisoner. The guards made their rounds every hour through the night, shining flashlights into cells, doing quick visual checks. They weren't looking for elaborate tricks. They were just confirming presence. A shape on a bunk, a head on a pillow. That was enough. So Morris and his team would give them what they expected to see. They would sculpt their own heads. The base material was a problem. They couldn't use clay. Where would they get clay? They couldn't use wood, too difficult to carve in the darkness of their cells with limited tools. They needed something malleable, something that could be shaped by hand. Something they could access without arousing suspicion. The answer was soap. Bars of soap were standard issue. Every prisoner received them, and soap, when wet and kneaded, becomes almost like clay, soft, moldable. It could be shaped, smoothed, carved into basic forms. But soap alone wasn't enough. It was too white, too obviously artificial. They needed to create a material that looked like flesh, that had the right color, the right texture, the right weight and density. They experimented. Mixed soap shavings with toilet paper pulp, creating a papier-mâché compound. Added paint, stolen in tiny amounts from the prison's maintenance supplies, smuggled back to cells, in pockets, under shirts, anywhere they could hide it. Mixed in concrete dust from their chipping work, which gave the mixture weight and a greyish tone that approximated skin. The formula took weeks to perfect. Too much soap and it would be too white, too obviously fake. Too much concrete and it would be too heavy, too dark. The balance had to be exact. And they had to make multiple heads, one for each man, which meant replicating the formula consistently, working by feel in near darkness, using their hands and crude tools fashioned from scrap metal. They began to sculpt, starting with rough forms, basic head shapes, then refining, adding details, cheekbones, jawlines, noses, ears, eye sockets, lips. It was painstaking work. Every feature had to be carefully shaped, smoothed, allowed to dry, then refined again. The drying process took time, and the heads had to be hidden during day, worked on only at night when the guards weren't looking. But the real artistry came with the finishing. The heads had to look real in the dark, under a blanket, viewed from several feet away by a guard with a flashlight. That meant texture. That meant color variation. That meant making these soap and paper masks look like human faces. They used paint, carefully mixed to create flesh tones. Not one color, but several, layered to create depth. Darker tones in the recesses, under the cheekbones, in the eye sockets, lighter tones on the high points, the forehead, the nose, the chin, creating the illusion of dimension through nothing but shading. And then the hair. This was where the barbershop clippings became essential. Real human hair, glued to the scalp of the dummy heads with whatever adhesive they could manufacture or steal. Some accounts say they used toothpaste. Others mention a paste made from soap and water. Whatever the method, it worked. The hair was attached in small clumps, positioned to match each man's actual hairstyle. The result was remarkable. In good light, close-up, the heads would never pass inspection. They were obviously fake, obviously crude. But in darkness, from a distance, with a guard expecting to see a sleeping prisoner and just doing a quick visual confirmation, they were perfect. But the heads were only one part of the deception. The escapees needed to create the illusion of occupied bunks, so they constructed body forms, rolled up clothing and blankets arranged to suggest a human shape under covers, arms positioned naturally, everything designed to maintain the illusion for as long as possible. They practiced. During the daytime, when they were out of their cells for work or recreation, they would position the dummies, then return and assess from the cell block floor, from the angles guards would see, adjusting, refining, making sure every detail worked. Alan West, the fourth member of the team, worked on his dummy head with the same dedication. But West had a problem. His cell was slightly different, his positioning not quite as ideal for the deception. And as the escape date approached, West began to fall behind in his preparations. While Morris and the Anglins were fashioning the other critical component of the escape, the raft, West was still struggling with his ventilation grate, still chipping away, not quite ready.
The concrete in his cell was slightly harder, or he was slightly less skilled, or he was just unlucky. Whatever the reason, West was lagging. The raft was perhaps the most ambitious part of the entire plan. The bay water would kill them in minutes without some kind of flotation device. They couldn't swim the distance, nobody could. They needed a raft. And they needed to build it in secret, in prison, with no tools and no materials except what they could steal or improvise. The solution was ingenious and desperate in equal measure. Raincoats. The standard issue Alcatraz raincoat was made of rubberized canvas, waterproof, flexible, and if you had enough of them, if you could seal them together somehow, they could potentially be fashioned into an inflatable raft. The problem was acquiring enough raincoats without arousing suspicion. Each prisoner had one, but they needed more, many more. Over 50 according to later FBI calculations. How do you steal 50 raincoats from a maximum security prison without anyone noticing? The answer? Slowly, one at a time. During work details, during recreation, whenever an opportunity presented itself. A coat left unattended. A coat from storage that wouldn't be missed immediately. A coat from a prisoner who was transferred or released. Every acquisition was a risk, but over months the collection grew. They hid the coats in the utility corridor behind their cells. The same space they'd been working in for months, chipping away at concrete, the space that had become their workshop, their staging area, their secret world. And then came the truly difficult part, construction. They had to transform these raincoats into a functioning raft. That meant sealing the seams, creating airtight compartments, building something that could hold air, hold weight, survive the violence of bay waters. They used contact cement, stolen from the prison maintenance supplies, but contact cement alone wasn't enough. The seams had to be reinforced, sealed, made as waterproof as possible.
They used heat. The steam pipes that ran through the utility corridor could be used to heat seal the rubber, fusing the seams together. The design was surprisingly sophisticated. Not just a single large raft, but multiple compartments. Like a modern inflatable raft, this increased redundancy. If one section was punctured, the others would keep it afloat. The thinking was sound. The execution was crude but effective.
They also fashioned life vests from the raincoats, personal flotation devices that each man would wear, ensuring that even if the raft failed completely, they'd have a chance of surviving long enough to reach shore. And they made paddles, wooden pieces salvaged from whatever they could find, broom handles, pieces of shelving, scraps from the workshop, shaped and smoothed into crude oars. Not elegant, but functional. Every piece of equipment was tested as much as possible given the constraints. The raincoat material was checked for airtightness. The paddles were tested for weight and balance. The life vests were tried on, adjusted, refined. Nothing could be left to chance. But there was one element they couldn't test. They couldn't test whether the raft would actually float with the weight of 3 men. They couldn't test whether it would survive the currents and the cold and the violence of the bay. They couldn't test whether their paddles would be strong enough to provide propulsion against the tide. They would find out on the night of the escape. And if they were wrong, if their calculations failed, if the raft sank or the life vests didn't work, they would die. Quickly, alone, in the dark water, with the lights of San Francisco mocking them from the shore. The other major component of the plan was the route. Getting out of the cells was step 1, but then they had to navigate through the prison interior, reach the roof, descend to ground level, cross the island, and launch the raft. Each stage had its own challenges. The utility corridor behind the cells led upward. There was a ventilation shaft, a vertical passage that could be climbed. It was narrow, claustrophobic, and dark, but it led to the roof access. From there, they would be on top of the cell block, exposed to the elements and to any guard who happened to look up, but also unobserved by the internal security. The roof presented its own problems. They would have to navigate across it in darkness,
avoiding searchlights from the guard towers. Then they would need to descend. The plan called for using a drain pipe on the exterior of the building, 50 feet of pipe, old and possibly rusted, that they would have to climb down while wearing makeshift life vests and carrying equipment. If the pipe broke, if a guard saw them, if they made noise and alerted the dogs, any of these failures would end the escape before they even reached the water. But if they made it down, they would be on the northeast shore of the island, a rocky beach area that was less patrolled than other sections. From there, they would inflate the raft using an improvised pump, a concertina, a musical instrument converted into an air pump. The plan was to inflate quickly and quietly, launch into the water, and paddle with everything they had toward Angel Island, a larger island about a mile away that would provide cover and a staging area for the next phase of the escape. The full plan was extraordinary in its complexity. Each element depended on the others. Each step had to work perfectly. And they had one chance, one night. If they failed, they would never get another opportunity. The prison would be on high alert. Their cells would be searched. The ventilation grates would be reinforced. Everything they'd built would be discovered and destroyed. As June approached, the tension mounted. Every day was a risk. Every interaction with guards carried the danger of discovery. They had to maintain their routines, act normally, give no indication that anything was wrong. One suspicious look from a guard, one random cell search, and it would all be over. Alan West was becoming a problem. His preparations were behind schedule. His ventilation grate still wasn't fully cleared. He kept assuring Morris and the Anglins that he'd be ready, that he'd make it, that they should stick to the plan. But doubt was creeping in. Morris faced a decision. Wait for West, risking discovery with every additional day, or proceed without him, leaving their fourth man behind. The decision was made to proceed. June 11th would be the night, with or without West. They couldn't wait any longer. The odds of discovery were increasing. The summer weather was optimal. The tides would be favorable. Everything aligned. On June 10th, the day before the escape, final preparations were completed. The dummy heads were positioned and tested one last time. The raft was checked and rechecked. The route was reviewed mentally, each step visualized. Tools were staged. Equipment was hidden where it could be quickly accessed, and the men prepared themselves psychologically. Tomorrow night, they would attempt the impossible. They would either escape or die trying. There would be no middle ground, no capture and return to their cells. If they were caught in the attempt, they would likely be shot. If they made it to the water and the raft failed, they would drown. But if they succeeded, if everything worked, if the years of planning and months of preparation paid off, they would be free, truly free. No more cells, no more guards, no more looking at San Francisco through bars and knowing they would never walk those streets. The night of June 10th, Frank Morris lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, this would all be over, one way or another. Tomorrow, he would know if the word impossible really meant what everyone said it meant, or if it was just a barrier that nobody had been determined enough to break through. The dummy head sat on his shelf, staring at him with painted eyes and a crude smile. A mirror image, a ghost. Tomorrow night, that ghost would take his place while he slipped through the wall and into legend. The rock was about to be broken, and 3 men were about to discover whether genius and desperation could overcome cold water and crushing odds. June 11th, 1962, the escape from Alcatraz. The night was coming. There's a moment that happens on Alcatraz Island tours. The guide brings visitors to cell 138B, Frank Morris's cell. They point to the ventilation grate. They explain the escape. And then they ask the question, do you think they made it? Hands go up. Half the room says yes, half says no, and the debate begins. People who've never met before, who have no connection to the case, who weren't even born when the escape happened, suddenly have passionate opinions about whether 3 criminals survived a swim across San Francisco Bay 63 years ago. That's the power of this story. It refuses to let go. It demands engagement. It asks us to choose. Do we believe in the possibility of the impossible, or do we accept the cold statistics of probability? The official position has remained consistent for decades. The FBI concluded the men drowned. The evidence supports this conclusion. The cold water, the strong currents, the failed raft, the absence of any confirmed sightings, all of it points to death in the bay, bodies claimed by the water, never to be recovered. But the official position has never satisfied everyone, because absence of proof isn't proof of absence. No bodies means no certainty, and into that uncertainty flows hope, speculation, theory, and the enduring human desire for the underdog to win. Let's examine the evidence for death. It's substantial. The water temperature alone should have been fatal. 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause hypothermia in remarkably short time. Without wetsuits, without proper insulation, the men would have lost body heat rapidly. Their muscles would have seized. Their ability to swim would have degraded. Eventually, they would have lost consciousness and drowned. The distance was another factor. 1.25 miles to the nearest shore. That's a long way in cold water, fighting currents. Even strong swimmers struggle with that distance in a pool. In the bay, at night, it's exponentially harder, and the raft failed. We know this because pieces of it were found, deflated and torn. Without the raft, their chances plummeted. They would have been relying solely on their crude life vests and their ability to swim. Against those odds, survival seems impossible. Professional analysis supports this conclusion. In 2003, the television show Mythbusters attempted to recreate the escape. Using period-accurate materials, building a raft exactly as the escapees had, they launched from the same shore at the same time of night. Their raft worked better than expected. They made it across to Angel Island, but they were wearing wetsuits. They had support boats nearby. They had modern safety equipment as backup. And even with all those advantages, they described the experience as terrifying, exhausting, dangerous. Without wetsuits, without support, the Mythbusters team estimated survival at less than 1%. Possible, but barely. More likely, the cold and currents would have killed the escapees within an hour of entering the water. The FBI interviewed countless experts, oceanographers, hypothermia specialists, professional swimmers. All of them said essentially the same thing. Survival was statistically improbable to the point of impossibility. So why do people persist in believing Morris and the Anglins survived? Why does the mystery endure? Partly because of the lack of bodies. The human mind struggles with ambiguity. We want closure. We want definitive answers. The bay gives up most of its dead. Bodies float, they wash ashore, they're found. But not these bodies. Not in 63 years. That absence creates space for doubt. Partly because of the tantalizing near evidence. The Christmas cards allegedly received by the Anglin family, the photograph from Brazil, the 2013 letter claiming to be from John Anglin. None of these prove survival. All of them could be hoaxes or coincidences, but they keep hope alive. They suggest the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the impossible happened. And partly because we want them to have survived. There's something deeply appealing about the idea of three men outsmarting the system, beating impossible odds, living free lives under new identities. It's a good story. Maybe too good to be true, but good enough that we want it to be true. The cultural impact of the escape is undeniable. Books have been written, movies made. The 1979 film Escape from Alcatraz, starring Clint Eastwood as Frank Morris, introduced the story to a new generation. It portrayed Morris as a brilliant, determined man who refused to accept imprisonment. The film ends ambiguously, with Morris disappearing into the fog. Survival implied but not confirmed. That ambiguity is perfect. It mirrors reality. Because we don't know what happened, the story can be whatever we need it to be. For some people, it's a tragedy. Three desperate men who died trying to be free. For others, it's a triumph. Three brilliant escapees who beat the system and lived to tell no one about it. The U.S. Marshals Service still maintains the case. The warrants for Morris and the Anglins remain active. If they're alive, they're wanted fugitives. If they're dead, the warrants are meaningless. But keeping them active sends a message. We haven't given up. The case isn't closed. Justice hasn't been served. Every few years, a new lead emerges. Someone claims to have information. Someone reports a sighting. Someone analyzes the old evidence with new technology. In 2015, a Dutch forensic scientist enhanced the Brazil photograph using modern facial recognition software. His conclusion was that there was a significant probability the men in the photo were the Anglin brothers. Not certainty, but probability. The Anglin family maintains the men survived. They point to the photograph, the Christmas cards, family stories about messages received in coded ways. They believe their brothers made it to Brazil, lived there for years, possibly died there as old men.
They want the truth acknowledged, want the survivor's story told. But without proof, it remains belief, faith, hope, not evidence. The most likely scenario, according to most experts, is this. Morris and the Anglins made it off Alcatraz. They inflated their raft, they paddled into the bay. They fought the currents and the cold. Maybe they made it halfway. Maybe they nearly reached shore. But the raft failed. We know this from the recovered pieces. Once in the water without flotation, hypothermia set in rapidly. They lost strength, lost consciousness, drowned within sight of freedom. Their bodies were swept out to sea by the tides, lost in the vast Pacific, never to be recovered. It's a tragic ending, but it fits the evidence. It accounts for the failed raft, the lack of bodies, the absence of any confirmed sightings. They came so close, but close isn't enough. The bay doesn't give credit for effort, but here's the counter-argument, the one that keeps the mystery alive. If that's what happened, why no bodies? The bay covers about 1,600 square miles, but it's heavily trafficked. Boats, ferries, Coast Guard patrols, bodies float, they're found. The absence of any remains, even fragments, even bones washed up on some distant shore, suggests either incredible bad luck or the possibility that there were no bodies to find, because the men didn't die in the bay. Could they have made it? Let's game it out. Assume the raft held together longer than the evidence suggests. Assume they made it to Angel Island or the Marin shore, cold and exhausted but alive. What then? They would have needed to get off the shore immediately, find shelter, find warmth, avoid hypothermia in the critical hours after emerging from the water. Let's assume they did this, broke into a building, found clothes, managed to survive the night. Next morning, they'd need transportation, money, new identities. They'd need to split up, because 3 men traveling together would be memorable, suspicious. They'd need to get out of California, out of the region, disappear into the vastness of America. Could they do it? Morris was smart enough, resourceful enough. But the Anglins were bank robbers, not master criminals. They didn't have networks, contacts, sophisticated support systems. They would have been improvising, desperate, making it up as they went. The FBI blanketed the area, roadblocks, airport surveillance, bus and train station monitoring. Every hospital was alerted, every police department. If the men had sought medical treatment, bought bus tickets, tried to rent a car, they would have been caught. Unless they had help, unless someone on the outside was waiting, providing transportation, providing money, providing shelter while the search cooled down. This is possible. The men could have coordinated with someone before the escape, made arrangements, created a support network. But no evidence of such a network has ever been found. No accomplices were identified. No family members showed signs of suddenly having the funds to support 3 fugitives. The FBI investigated thoroughly. If outside help existed, it left no trace. So we're left with the same question we started with. Did they survive? And the honest answer is, we don't know. We'll probably never know. The evidence is ambiguous enough to support either conclusion. And 63 years later, with everyone involved likely dead, the truth may be permanently lost. But perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the Alcatraz escape deserves to remain forever unresolved. Because the escape itself, the brilliant planning, the patient execution, the audacious attempt, is remarkable regardless of the outcome. These men did what no one else managed to do in 29 years of Alcatraz operation. They breached the most secure prison in America. They made it off the rock. That alone is extraordinary.
Whether they died 50 yards from shore or lived to old age in Brazil doesn't change the achievement of the escape itself. They beat the guards, beat the security,
beat the prison. The bay might have beaten them in the end, but the prison didn't. And for men who'd spent years in cages, that counts for something. The empty cells remain on Alcatraz. Tourists walk past them every day. The ventilation grates are sealed now, but the holes are still visible. The story is told and retold, and every time, someone in the group says, "I think they made it." And someone else says, "No way, they drowned." And the debate continues. That's the legacy. Not certainty, but conversation. Not closure, but mystery. Not answers, but questions that never get old, because they can never be definitively answered. Frank Morris was a criminal. John and Clarence Anglin were criminals. They'd committed crimes, been convicted, been sentenced. The law said they belonged in prison. Society said they were dangerous. Alcatraz said they were the worst of the worst. But they were also human beings who wanted freedom, who wanted it badly enough to spend months chipping away at concrete with stolen spoons, who wanted it badly enough to risk drowning in freezing water, who wanted it badly enough to attempt what everyone said was impossible. And whether they succeeded or failed in the final analysis, that desperate human desire for freedom is something we can all understand, even if we wouldn't act on it, even if we follow the rules and obey the law and accept the boundaries society places on us. We can understand the impulse, the dream, the willingness to risk everything for a chance at liberty. That's why the story endures, not because of what happened, but because of what it represents. The eternal human struggle against confinement, against limitation, against being told what we can and cannot do. The rock was designed to be unbreakable. The prison was designed to be escape-proof. The word impossible was carved into every wall, every bar, every policy and procedure, and 3 men looked at that word and refused to accept it. They might have died trying, probably died trying if we're honest about the odds, but they tried. That's the story. That's what matters. They refused to accept impossibility as final. They refused to let the rock define the limits of their lives. Somewhere in San Francisco Bay, or along its shores, or in some distant country living under assumed names, or in the vast archives of unsolved mysteries, the answer waits. The truth of what happened to Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin on the night of June 11th, 1962. We may never find it, and perhaps we're not meant to. Perhaps the mystery is the point, the question that has no answer, the story that has no ending. The bay is still there, still cold, still moving with relentless currents. Alcatraz still stands, empty now, a tourist attraction instead of a prison. The cells are silent, the guard towers unmanned. The walls no longer hold anyone. But the legend holds, the story persists, and every time someone asks, did they make it? We're transported back to that June night, to 3 desperate men in a homemade raft, fighting for freedom against impossible odds. Did they win? Did they lose? Did they die heroes or fools? We don't know. And that not knowing, that permanent uncertainty, that void where answers should be, that's the final, most enduring part of the escape from Alcatraz. The rock was broken, but the mystery remains unbroken, forever suspended between triumph and tragedy, forever lost in the fog, forever asking the question that has no answer. Did they survive? Listen closely. The bay is still out there. The currents still pull. The cold still kills. And somewhere in that dark water, or on some distant shore, or in the silence of 3 unmarked graves, the truth waits, waiting to be discovered, or waiting to remain hidden forever. Either way, the legend of the Alcatraz escape will outlive all of us. 3 ghosts who slipped through walls and disappeared into mystery. 3 men who refused to accept the word impossible. Whether they lived or died, they're immortal now, forever escaping, forever free, forever falling through darkness toward an ending we'll never see. The story of Alcatraz ends not with an answer, but with silence. The silence of the bay, the silence of empty cells, the silence of 3 men who spoke once with desperate action, and then were never heard from again. And in that silence, the question echoes. Did they survive?